Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this game that I'm working on here in Mexico City. And this game has deep roots to some of my earliest work, and also kind of connects with my childhood and some of the goals that I had as a child and the experiences that I had, particularly my experiences with space and kind of traveling the world and engaging with the space around me in a very intimate way, in a sensorial way, and not necessarily in a mechanical way. And, it kind of also goes back to these ideas of authenticity and personal significance that I've been developing for many years now, which is kind of a formalization of some of these ideas that I've had growing up as a kid that were really emotional and difficult for me to pin down. And so this is kind of the more formal side of that, and the more adult side of that. And I'm trying to merge those two things, kind of this adult kind of formalism that I have, and this childhood kind of sense of complete overwhelming, sensorial overwhelmment, I don't think that's a word, of my experiences in space as a child. So with authenticity and personal significance, it's all about having a player enter a space and being attached to the space and the artifacts within it. Being attached to it in such a way that they believe that it is not real, because of course it's not real, it's digital, it's virtual, but believing that it's authentic, right? It's in a sense a real digital virtual space, and that kind of redeems it, right? Like, you don't necessarily need a deep mechanical or structural way of interacting with this world, as long as you can believe it's real, because if you believe it's real, it's authentic, then it's a place that you can escape to, it's a place that you can believe in, it's a place that you can feel emotionally attached to and develop a relationship with, which kind of strengthens this bond between the player, the experiencer, right? It's not really a game at this point, it's an experience, it's a world, it's a verse, it's a universe. That relationship between the player and the artist and the world, this kind of trinity of these three things is really important, right? We each kind of have a say in this thing. So, I have this kind of theory that links the authenticity of artifacts, sort of objects or items, right? The authenticity of places in the world, or frames, as we will see, and the authenticity of characters, which is something that I'm not going to focus on in this talk, right? But how does a player become attached, find personal significance of a place, right? Again, I said, characters, places, artifacts, like objects or items, right? These are all things that kind of share, as we will see, these kind of tenets of authenticity, these tenets or pillars or metrics that I've kind of developed over the years. Well, so the way I like to think about space is thinking about space in terms of frames. Right, so why not just look at pictures, right? I can also draw pretty pictures. I can't really, right? But I can in principle, right? So it's like, why would we? What's the point of an interactive space? Well, there are many layers to the answer to that question. But in terms of the authenticity of places, the way that players kind of interact with space, or just people interact with space, in general, right, is kind of finding these frames, right? Finding these perspectives on space and becoming attached to these perspectives, right? Coming back to this frame, being like, oh, I remember this, right? I was here at this time, I was doing this thing, and I was looking from this perspective, right? Or this beautiful framing that you constructed. The frame is made most explicit in the camera and the photograph, right? But also just in the mind's eye, or not in the mind's eye, sorry, in the literal eye, right? As you kind of walk around and explore space. And these frames are things that you can become personally attached to, right? And not just frames, but also there is something about like sort of this more blurry sense of being at a location, right? You can kind of get personally attached to this place, right? And sorry, let me explain what I mean by that. When you kind of enter a space for the first time, there's this period of kind of exploring the boundaries of the space, or finding the kind of the nexuses of this space, right? The places where things converge, in the confluence of lines and traffic and all these other sorts of things, right? And you kind of connect these things together. This is the process of exploration. And as you connect these things together, you kind of build this map. And I think one of the interesting things about game design in this space is that map can be explicit mechanically, or it can be implicit in the player's mind. But either way, you kind of get this significance, which I think is really interesting. So So those are the two things you kind of got to nail. I think like being able to build the frames, not build the frames, but build the space of frames for players to become attached to, and also build this literal physical space that players can explore and kind of build this mental map of, right? And those two things are what's key to making space interesting in games, but that's not all, right? Because so I can talk a little bit about the pillars that I believe lead to making something like that interesting, and I will, thusly, I suppose. But like also, it's not just that; it's also making the space feel authentic. Because if I feel like this is too constructed, then the world doesn't feel authentic anymore. It feels like a film set, right? Which is kind of my worst nightmare. This is like the last thing that I want the world to feel like is pieces of cardboard constructed for the purpose of the player to, because as soon as the player sees behind the cardboard, right, the illusion, there shouldn't be an illusion, and that's the whole point, right? So kind of diving into that a little bit, but also talking about developing personal significance. So I as I've said, I kind of developed these pillars, and I developed them originally for kind of artifacts, for items, but they also apply well to space. And there are many of them, and not in any particular order. So one, for example, is uniquity, and that's this idea that that all these frames are kind of different, right? And there's something that can be said about kind of passing or surpassing this complexity barrier in the human brain. Like once something becomes sort of after this certain level of complexity, the brain starts building heuristic level pattern matching or patterns, which means that the brain's kind of accepted it as being quote unquote real, right? Because there's this certain bar of complexity, and that's some neuroscientific garbage that I just made up, but that I have kind of followed as a design principle. I think it makes sense, right? Okay, so uniquity doesn't necessarily strictly mean there's a couple of traps, right? So first of all, it doesn't mean that you have a lot of things. It just means that the things that you do have are sufficiently unique, right? So as much as I love kind of this idea of scaling to these huge worlds and all these things, you can also have these kind of minimalist environments as long as you follow these principles. And I hope, right? And the other trap with uniquity, the big thing to point out is that, the real point, or not the real point, but one of the key things here is that you're just not cloning things, right? Like the idea of uniquity is that even if you have 1,000 identical things, they're not identical. There are 1,000 different things that look the same, which is kind of this weird kind of oxymoronic statement, but it's really important to me, right? Like everybody has a different mobile phone. Maybe they're all the same brand or whatever, but they're different phones, right? And they're different because because of the other pillars, which we'll get to. They're also different because of just minor differences, right, in build quality or so on and so forth, color, these kind of attributes. And so you can actually build this phase space, and think about all the artifacts in terms of how they're different. And you can do the same thing for frames and physical space. But moving on, right, this is kind of well understood by me. Okay, so what else is important? Well, this one thing I was just getting at, which is this idea of dynamism. And this is the idea that things change over time. And this is really, really important, right? The least interesting thing is something that never changes, right? You should be able to come back to the same frame and it's slightly different, right? Things as simple as the lighting has changed, right? The time of day has changed, the weather has changed, right? But this should also include things like, something's different about the space. Something has been moved, maybe a small object, right? There's different objects that are here now. There's some weathering, on the space, or like some pigeon poop on it. Like these kinds of things, right, that make space feel alive. This dynamism, the idea that things change. Okay, what else do we have? There's also this kind of I haven't really fully explored this idea yet, and so I have different words for it that all kind of don't really fit completely. This idea of interactivity, to really build personal significance, you have to have some kind of a little bit of control over it, right? You don't want to have complete control because that's sort of weird. It's kind of a power fantasy, but you want to have like a little bit of control over it, right? I haven't really thought about a great way to apply this to frames. In the artifact sense, the item sense, right? I mean, you can put stickers on your phone, right? You can get your phone in a different color. Well, that's sort of on the uniquity side, but you might lose a part. And you go and you find a part somewhere and you put that part in, right? And slowly this thing kind of changes based on, your kind of your activity on it. A better example of this is this idea of a car that you find that doesn't really work, kind of on the side of the street, and You kind of want to make this car work, right? But it requires some parts, and so you go out and maybe you find some parts. And what's really key about this experience about interactivity and fitting in with the whole pillars is there's not just one car, right? And there's not just one part. This isn't like a collect quest or a weird kind of baked narrative where it's like, we want you to be attached to this car, because if you don't, then you won't experience the narrative, and you suck at this weird dissonance of role-playing, right, where it's like, well, I guess I'd better find the parts for this car, otherwise, like, this game is worthless to me, right? No, this theoretical car is optional. It's this car, there's many cars, first of all, and some of them are in different states of disrepair, right? Maybe you found this one because you want to repair something, right? This is, like, valuable to you, or maybe this specific car is kind of the one that you really want, right? And so, you want to make it good, and it's missing like a wing mirror or something, and you go out and as you're looking for a wing mirror, there are many wing mirrors, right? It's not like there's one, right? But which one is the right one, right? Which one did you find when you were engaging with this frame in this part of the world, and you saw it, and you're like, oh, that would be perfect. And maybe along the way you found this other thing, the charm that you hang from the windshield, or the dice or whatever, and there's kind of discarded on the ground, and you build these attachments to things because you need to do them for some systemic purpose, not necessarily like a gameplay purpose, right? But some purpose that exists systemically in the world. This is kind of this idea of interactivity, and I think this probably also applies to frames as well. Although I haven't really thought about it. Maybe there's this idea of photography. I don't know. I'm not super into that. But this idea that you have some small control over the space, or maybe a garden or something, I haven't explored this, right? And this whole thing of interactivity is very fuzzy, so I should kind of get back to the pillars that make a lot more immediate sense. The next one is this idea of persistence, which is one of the most important pillars, I think, not because it's any more special than the others intrinsically, but because it's so overwhelmingly missed, I would say, in the space of design and game design, right? When people break persistence in games, I find it overwhelmingly jarring, an overwhelmingly discordant, dissonant experience that completely breaks me out of the immersion and ruins the feeling of any kind of authentic space for me, right? And there's a longer lecture here about persistence in looter shooters specifically, right? Or this idea of any kind of collection type game. Where, first of all, you have multiple scenes, which I think is heresy in and of itself, but at least you have multiple scenes and they're connected in some interesting way. Do I really want to get into this now? I don't know. So there's this whole, basically, kind of lecture about this duality of items, where it's like there are two kinds of items that AAA devs and indie devs, actually basically everyone, expect you to engage with in a game world. There are the items that you're expected to never become attached to, these kind of like Foley-esque items, right? These kind of like flavor items. These are like pieces of trash, like dirt particles, these kinds of things that are just there for the flair of, of the realism or whatever, right? And then, on the other hand, there are these objects that you're really supposed to get attached to, right? Like this gun that was procedurally generated or you bought or something, or I don't know, this hat that you had or whatever, right? And persistence is like this kind of key problem, because for the trash, right, let's say you saw this like, tomato soup can or something, and you're really interested in it, right? Well, in most games there's nothing you can do for two reasons. One is the interaction model never supports the ability to pick this thing up or do anything interesting with it, right? So you can't even take it. But maybe you can like balance it in your player model, and I've like tried to do this in, for example, in Jalopy, I've tried to kind of like carry a thing around with me. But then you run into the second problem, which is these items will just despawn. They just will, because they were never meant to, and it's just so stupid, because the minute you see something disappear out of thin air, right? That's the minute that you see the film set, right? You see the fakeness, the lie for what it is, and it's untenable, right? On the other hand, the objects that you're actually supposed to be attached to have a plethora of separate issues, which I'm not really prepared to talk about, and I've written about, and so I'm kind of waffling here, but usually the representation is very strange. It's like, really, you should have this deeply diegetic representation where if you own an object, you should be able to pull it out and look at it, right, and inspect it, to kind of engage with it and learn about what it is. But of course, no, right? Gamers, you have this gun, but like 90% of the time, you're not really looking at the gun. You're looking at this like rendering flat image of it in your inventory, whatever that is, right? And it's mostly represented by numbers, and at this point, the gun isn't a real artifact. It's just some more numbers, right? And so, why am I supposed to care about it, right? Physically based animation goes a long way here, and so on and so forth. But persistence. This object has to have a fixed, not fixed as in it never changes, but like the representation has to be a coherent representation across time and space, right? Like if you acquire this object, then it has to go somewhere and it has to look like something, right? And you should be able to engage with it at that level, right? And maybe you have all these immediate things like, well, I'm not gonna have fun unless I can carry 100 guns in my bag. I'm like, that's fine, right? Like all these things are fine. I'm not talking about realism, physical realism. I'm talking about authenticity. You need to have that thread of representation, right? That is consistent. Persistence. This is important. Okay. So it's a golden rule, right? Nothing should ever leave the space, and nothing should ever enter the space from nowhere, right? Everything comes from something, right? And this really isn't that hard. Like that's the main thing. Like it's not like you need some genius physics engine or generative system. You just have to follow these rules. It's that simple, right? This can all be authored content, okay? So there's this great idea of lifespan, right? When we have the combined tenets of dynamism and persistence, this idea of like an object that exists in the space and it kind of degrades over time, but never really leaves the space, right? Maybe it degrades into multiple parts and trash and they kind of leave, right? Or it degrades into something that's kind of unusable or blackened or burned, this kind of idea, but it's always going to be there, right? And that's what, it's great. It goes all the way back to people who were a kid and had, that one stuffed toy that kind of just became more and more disgusting over time. It's kind of this idea, right, that like you find these glasses lying on the street, like, oh, these are great, and you carry them around with you, right? And you become attached to it because you found it, right? And maybe you can wear them as well or something, right? And they kind of change over time, and maybe you sit down and you bend them by accident and you break them, and it's this whole narrative moment that's really strong. It's like, oh, I found these, but then I accidentally snapped them or sat down, right? Or maybe, and this is important, what I'm about to describe is important to encode mechanically into quote-unquote gameplay, right? This idea of just like, oh, you lost them, right? You sat down and you forgot to, there's some mechanic, right? Like you forgot to, you put them in a place that was unsteady and they kind of fell off, right? And you didn't notice, and then you're like, where are my glasses? Like, oh no, right? And you have to go find them, right? And just think about how much we're engaging like a collect quest, right? Like this is the collect, where it's just like, no, it's not like go collect the 5 mushrooms, right? It's like, no, I lost my glasses, I want to go find them, right? It's such a kind of qualitatively interesting experience, a real authentic experience, right? So persistence, dynamism, uniquity. What else is there? Interactivity, right? There's some other things, there's like legacy, right? This idea that stuff doesn't just come from nothing, right? It's not all just like oddly authored content. So this idea, legacy, better way of describing it, maybe I'll come up with a better word, is like there shouldn't be anything in your universe that kind of comes like externally from the universe, because that means that you would be lying to the player in some way. And another way of expressing this is you shouldn't tease the player with a representation that kind of claims to be more than it is, or promises more than the player can actually do. And what I mean by this, I don't mean like what the player can do with their skills or whatever. What I literally mean, like, your representation should never include something that is externally, like, let me just give you an example. Here's an obvious one. Don't put doors if they can't be opened, right? Don't build building facades that look like, they have windows and doors if you can't go inside and engage with them, right? This is just, no, because there is nothing you can ever come up with that will explain why this is reasonable, right? Some player is going to want to go engage with that. And I've met players like this. I know players like this personally, right? And in some ways I'm this player, right? Like, this is not a dumb thing, right? It's not like a gamer moment, this is like, this is a real thing. You're lying to players by giving them this idea of something that, and when they engage with this thing that isn't real, it just emphasizes the fact that you're in a film set, and that's not fun, right? Unless you're there for a mechanical reason, unless it's an esport, unless there's this overarching thing, right? But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about spaces that are engaging, that are interesting for people, okay? And, okay, so you have that. And, sorry, I got a little bit lost. You have that. And so you might be like, well, how do I make anything, right? Well, you just don't, right? Just don't break the rules, right? For example, I'm making this game about space and engaging with space and architecture, right? You're like, well, how are you going to do that without making doors, right? And that's going to take a lot of work, isn't it? And that's impossible, and so on and so forth. And I mean, one answer to this is like, no, and I could generate interior and all these things, right? Or do it manually. But actually, like, I know what I want. I know what I'm trying to express as a designer, as a space designer, right? I'm trying to express shape and aperture and contrast and all these things, right? I don't need doors or windows for that, or maybe I do, right? When I need them, but it's not important to me, for example, that I'm making a space that looks like, a real space, right? A real urban space, or like New York City or something, right? What's important to me is that I'm building a space that you can engage in, right? So maybe my buildings just, maybe they'll have a detail and greeble of these kinds of things. Maybe they won't have doors or windows, right? And in this way, you start to get this idea of legacy. Another great example is like a car with an AC in it. It doesn't do anything. It's just there. There's a texture, bump map, whatever, a physically modeled or a modeled AC, like in a mesh, right? And it doesn't do anything. So you're like, why is it there, right? And then that's what I mean, right? You don't want these things that are external to the space. Legacy also interact kind of deeply with generative content and procedural content generation, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but that's kind of where its roots were, where it came from, and where I think there's a lot more to say about how to do generative content properly, how to make randomness, how to have something that's not random. That's kind of the main concept of legacy. So maybe I'm blurring some ideas a little bit. And I think there's some other stuff that I might be missing, but really the last one that I think is relevant here is this idea of saturation. And saturation is a weird one because it's not really, I don't think, a contributor to authenticity. It's more of a direct contributor to personal significance. And the idea of saturation is just, you can't oversaturate the player with content, interesting content, because if you do, they'll very quickly become desensitized to it. And they'll lose any real sense of being able to attach themselves, right? And a lot of roguelikes have this problem where you're constantly building a new character every single time. And the first time you build a character, it's a really engaging, really holistic, really kind of deep and emotional experience. And like the 100th time you do it, it's like no longer interesting, right? It's just something that you get through because you're sick of getting through it, right? And the best games that kind of handle personal significance handle this idea of saturation very well. They only kind of drip and little drips, in content, so that you can slowly kind of acclimate yourself to this rich and interesting and beautiful world. I think a great example of this is XCOM. There are many things where XCOM is not a game that's about significance. It's a strategy game. It's about other things, and there are many failings in in XCOM with regards to authenticity. But there are many small successes because it's important that I have something to latch onto in AAA, like anything that kind of validates this theory or does some of these things in good ways. And XCOM is a good example with its characters because it really hits a lot of these pillars, at least in a small sense, where the main thing that you're attached to in XCOM is these characters, is these squad members, right? And they all have this kind of systemic purpose in the game, and they have these, and then they grow over time in a very limited sense, right? Dynamism. They all are visually differentiated and also skill-wise differentiated, uniquity in a small way, right? You have some level of control over how your squad comports itself, or the way it looks, right? Interactivity, and legacy kind of goes out the window, I suppose. But saturation is good though, because you start out with a squad of 3 or something like this, right? You slowly get these new recruits, and each one is kind of this new qualitative member of your party, and you can attach them because you could lose them, right? Again, you have this mechanical integration with the significance because you might lose this, right? You might make a mistake and you might lose a character, and this is a big moment in XCOM, right? And you could go even further if they became unfit for service later, right? And all these other sorts of things, right? This is a very compelling experience. So I've talked a little bit about how one might become attached to objects in space, or frames, or places in the world, and it's kind of the root of what I'm trying to accomplish in this game that I'm working on. Is kind of building this space where players become attached to the frames, the different space, where I get to express my goals in shape, design, and also there are these objects, these artifacts that you kind of engage with, and players become attached to these as well. And I think the best way to do that is to have the artifacts, these objects, have some kind of like limited systemic level of interaction with the space, and kind of be physically decomposable in some ways. And there are many fun kind of toys that are like that, right? Cameras, sequencers, field recorders, spray paint, glasses like apparel, watches, right? vehicles. These things that don't necessarily maybe express like a particular gameplay goal, right? But express kind of this qualitative richness of being in a space. Okay, and so this idea of those are kind of scattered around and this kind of thing. But they follow all the pillars. They erode and persist and all these other things. Or drones, or things you can make up or play little games with, like finding yourself or leaving breadcrumbs or a scavenger hunt or all sorts of things. At some level, like this isn't really deeply connected with my experience of being a child. My experience of being a child was highly sensorial, right? It was about engaging with the space, and these are ways that I think help people engage with the space, help different kinds of people approach engaging with space beyond just kind of walking around. But more on that later, about the just walking around part in the physical model and these kinds of things, and what makes that compelling. So, I've said a lot of things here. It's been 35 minutes, kind of covered a lot of the main topics. And thanks for listening. I'm going to start another recording now where I talk about the things that are actually difficult for me, that are the main problems that I'm having difficulty pursuing right now. Thanks.